March 9, 1945. 10:30 p.m. The night sky above Tokyo shimmered with a strange orange glow, as if the very heavens had caught fire. On the ground, millions of civilians looked upward in terror, hearing the distant growl of engines that multiplied with every passing second. The sound was not the high-pitched whine of fighters, nor the piercing scream of dive bombers. It was a rolling thunder, a carpet of engines stretched across the darkened Pacific. Entire neighborhoods shuddered as the first wave of American B-29 superfortresses broke through the clouds. Below them, the great city, the heart of the Japanese Empire, was unaware that it was about to endure the single deadliest air raid in human history. U.S. Army Air Force's Mission Report, March 1945. The Japanese military elite had laughed at the idea of American night raids. They had mocked the possibility that lumbering bombers could find their way over 1,000 miles of open ocean, strike their capital, and return unscathed. Their manuals dismissed night bombing as ineffective and random destruction. Japanese officers boasted that such efforts would be a waste of fuel, a nuisance at most. Japanese Air Defense Doctrine, 1944. Yet on this night, mockery turned to silence. Within minutes, Tokyo would burn. The first bombs did not explode in thunderous blasts. Instead, they hissed as small canisters tumbled from the bellies of the B-29s. Each one split open mid-air, scattering hundreds of incendiary bomblets that rained onto the city below. Wooden homes, centuries-old neighborhoods, and the tightly packed alleys of Tokyo ignited like kindling. The fires spread faster than fire brigades could react. Entire districts vanished in sheets of flame. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. American pilots flying above reported the firestorm as a living creature. Flames leapt hundreds of feet into the air, pulling oxygen into their vortex. The inferno generated its own winds, tearing roofs off houses, hurling debris into the air and feeding itself with every gust. Survivors later recalled the sound of the firestorm as a deafening roar like a hurricane made of flame. Eyewitness testimony, Tokyo Metropolitan Archives. On the ground, chaos reigned. Families fled toward rivers and canals, clutching what few belongings they could carry. Mothers shielded children with wet blankets. Soldiers abandoned air defense posts, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the catastrophe. The fire consumed everything indiscriminately. Homes, factories, shrines, schools. Entire wards disappeared overnight, their population reduced to ash. Tokyo Fire Department Report, 1945. This was no accident of war. It was the product of deliberate planning, a radical shift in American air strategy. In 1944, precision bombing by daylight had failed to bring Japan to its knees. High-altitude raids scattered bombs wide of their targets, and the weather over the Pacific made accuracy nearly impossible. But under the command of General Curtis LeMay, the U.S. Army Air Forces abandoned old doctrine. They stripped the B-29s of their defensive guns, loaded them to the brim with incendiaries, and sent them in at night, low and fast. The result was devastation on an unprecedented scale. JSAF Tactical Directives, Feb 1945. Tokyo was not prepared. Japanese air defenses were designed to counter daylight raids, not nocturnal firebombing runs. Radar coverage was limited, searchlights ineffective against waves of aircraft that slipped in under cloud cover. Anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly, their shells bursting harmlessly in empty sky. Fighters scrambled, but fuel shortages and limited training made interceptions rare and ineffective. Japanese officers who had once ridiculed night raids now faced an enemy they could neither see nor stop. Imperial Japanese Army Air Defense Report, March 1945. As dawn broke on March 10th, the full scale of destruction was revealed. 16 square miles of Tokyo lay in ruins. Over 100,000 civilians were dead, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki. 1 million were homeless. Factories critical to the war effort had been obliterated, warehouses reduced to cinders. The once proud capital of the Empire of Japan had been transformed into a blackened wasteland. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For the Japanese military command, the raid was a humiliation. Days earlier, some officers had mocked American clumsiness, joking that night raids would be like throwing stones into the sea. Now their capital had been nearly erased in a single night. The whispers of disbelief spread through every level of the army. dramatized composite. How can a nation that fumbles by day strike with such precision at night? The ridicule of American raids had turned into stunned silence, and silence into dread. The attack was more than destruction. It was psychological warfare. Japanese civilians, once assured that the Imperial Army would defend them, now realized the enemy could strike the heart of their nation at will. Morale plummeted. Panic grew. Survivors whispered that Tokyo itself had been abandoned by its gods. Japanese Civilian Morale Report, 1945. Meanwhile, in Washington and Guam, the lessons were clear. What had begun as an experiment would become doctrine. Firebombing raids spread to Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Every major city in Japan would feel the firestorm before the war's end. Engineers and factory workers back home fueled this transformation. At plants in Wichita, Omaha, and Seattle, production lines turned out hundreds of B-29s a month. Chemists and metallurgists perfected incendiary gels and magnesium casings. Technicians modified bomb bays to carry maximum payloads. Every advance tightened the noose around Japan's cities. Boeing factory records, 1944-45. Yet beneath the triumph lay a haunting question. Was this necessary destruction or something darker? Allied commanders debated, but the momentum of war and the drive to force Japan's surrender left little room for hesitation. LeMay himself would later admit, if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been tried as war criminals. Interview with General Curtis LeMay. 1946. The night of March 9th at 10 was only the beginning. In the coming weeks, flames would consume city after city. Japan's officers, once dismissive of American air power, would watch helplessly as their homeland was reduced to ash. The mockery was over. A new fear had taken hold, and yet this devastation did not arise from sheer brutality alone. Behind the firestorms lay a hidden factor, a technical advantage so overlooked that Japanese planners never saw it coming. It was not merely the bombers or the bombs, it was something deeper, something invisible that gave the Americans the power to strike with such relentless precision. That secret would soon be revealed. March 10th, 1945. Dawn broke over Tokyo, but the sun revealed only smoke and ruin. For Japanese commanders, disbelief gave way to grim calculation. How had the Americans, clumsy daylight bombers by reputation, suddenly mastered the night sky? The answer was not chance nor divine favor. It was technology, logistics, and doctrine fused into a hidden advantage that few in Tokyo had ever considered possible. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The heart of that advantage was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of its age. Weighing over 60 tons fully loaded, with a wingspan of 141 feet and a top speed of 357 miles per hour, it could cruise at altitudes above 30,000 feet, well beyond the reach of many Japanese fighters. But in March 1945, General Curtis LeMay altered the formula. He ordered his crews to strip away most defensive guns, reduce their altitude to between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, and load maximum incendiary payloads. Each B-29 could carry nearly 7 tons of bombs. A single formation of 300 aircraft could deliver over 500 tons of fire in one night. Technical Manual TM 9-1345, 1945. This change alone could not explain the raid's precision. The real secret lay in the invisible domain of radio, radar, and navigation. While Japanese officers scoffed at American aimless night raids, U.S. engineers at MIT's radiation laboratory, along with manufacturers like Western Electric and General Electric, had spent years perfecting airborne radar systems. The B-29s flying over Tokyo carried the AN/APQ-13 radar, capable of mapping coastlines and city grids, even in total darkness. Operators could see the reflection of Tokyo Bay and the outline of the Sumida River on their screens, guiding the bombers unerringly to their targets. Bureau of Aeronautics Report, 1945. The incendiary weapons themselves were a marvel of engineering, created by chemists at Standard Oil and DuPont. The M69 incendiary cluster bomb, small and innocuous-looking, contained napalm gel, an invention of Harvard chemist Louis Fieser. Each bomblet ignited at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, adhering to wood, tatami mats, and clothing alike. A single B-29 could scatter thousands of these devices, creating overlapping fields of flame impossible to extinguish. Japanese civil defense units, armed with buckets of sand and bamboo poles, were hopeless against such science. U.S. Army Ordnance Report 1945. Even the timing of the raid was deliberate. Meteorologists, trained by the U.S. Weather Bureau, studied wind patterns over Tokyo. They identified a night when seasonal winds would fan flames and spread chaos. The raid's planners knew that a firestorm could only ignite if conditions were precise. Low humidity, steady winds, and tightly packed wooden structures. Tokyo was a perfect match. Army Air Force's Weather Division Report 1945. For the Japanese, the shock came not only from the destruction, but from the realization that their defenses had been rendered obsolete. Anti-aircraft gunners were trained to track formations at high altitude, not swarms flying in low at night. Their Type 88 75mm guns, effective at 25,000 feet, were nearly useless against bombers roaring past at 1/5 that height. Searchlights probed the sky in vain, unable to pin targets illuminated only briefly against the firelit clouds. Imperial Japanese Army Air Defense Manual 1944. The Battle of Tokyo was not the only test of this doctrine. Days later, on March 13th, LeMay's bombers struck Nagoya. Once again, radar screens guided them over coastlines. Incendiaries ignited slums, and fire consumed industrial districts. Nagoya, home to Mitsubishi's aircraft plants, lost over a quarter of its urban area in a single night. Reports from Japanese fighter squadrons described the attack as phantom-like. The enemy appeared without warning, delivered devastation, and vanished before meaningful resistance could be mounted. Dramatized composite. We never saw them until the city was already burning. Mitsubishi Factory Records, March 1945. On March 16th, Kobe burned. On March 19th, Nagoya again. Each time the cycle repeated. Radar-led navigation, low-altitude runs, and overwhelming firepower. The Japanese command reported catastrophic losses: 21% of Kobe destroyed, 18% of Osaka, 26% of Nagoya. By April, more than half of Japan's urban housing stock had been reduced to ashes. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. In one particularly devastating mission on May 23, 1945, over 520 B-29s struck Tokyo again. They dropped 4,500 tons of incendiaries in just 3 hours. The raid left more than 3.5 million homeless. Pilots recalled seeing the flames from 150 miles away, a column of smoke piercing the stratosphere. USAF Mission Log, May 1945. Japanese diaries spoke of despair, dramatized composite. It was as if the land itself had betrayed us. The city burned not once, but again and again. The factories behind this campaign were as important as the bombers themselves. In Wichita, Kansas, Boeing's Plant 2 employed over 30,000 workers, men and women who built the superfortress with meticulous precision. At the Glen L. Martin plant in Omaha, teams assembled bomb racks designed to hold incendiary clusters. In Seattle, draftsmen refined blueprints for lighter bomb bay doors, enabling faster release times. Each rivet, each circuit, was a link in the chain that stretched from American assembly lines to the burning streets of Tokyo. Boeing Production Records, 1944-45. This fusion of industrial might and scientific innovation overwhelmed Japan's assumptions. Officers who once mocked U.S. incompetence now wrote desperate memoranda. Dramatized composite. We underestimated their engineers as much as their soldiers. The empire's reliance on outdated doctrines and spiritual faith in the emperor could not compete with radar-guided precision and mass-produced firepower. Interrogation of Japanese officers 1946. And yet amid this destructive efficiency, the toll on the men who carried out the raids cannot be ignored. Crews flew missions lasting up to 14 hours, across open water patrolled by Japanese submarines and fighters. They faced flak bursts, mechanical failures, and the psychological weight of knowing their payloads would consume entire neighborhoods. Diaries of American airmen revealed sleepless nights and doubts. Dramatized composite. We were told we struck factories, but all I saw was fire where people lived. Aircrew Diary 1945. By mid-1945, Japanese cities were no longer safe havens. Every raid proved the same lesson. American bombers, guided by radar, fueled by industrial might, and armed with napalm, could reduce any urban center to ash. The strategy shattered more than buildings. It shattered illusions. The empire had believed itself invulnerable to the night. Now the night itself had turned against them, and still the question lingered: what would be the lasting impact of this campaign? Would it simply hasten surrender, or would it carve deeper scars, psychological, cultural, strategic, that would shape the future of war itself? By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer a nation of bustling cities, but of ashes and shadows. More than 60 urban centers had been reduced to smoldering ruins. In total, American B-29s dropped nearly 165,000 tons of incendiaries, leaving almost 9 million civilians homeless. What had begun in Tokyo as a terrifying experiment had become the standard doctrine of strategic warfare. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The effect was not measured only in burned factories or lost housing. It was psychological, shattering the confidence of an empire that once mocked the very idea of American night raids. For the Japanese high command, the raids were a humiliation as much as a tragedy. Interrogations after the war revealed a startling truth. Many officers had clung to the belief that America's technological advantage was temporary, that sheer willpower and sacrifice could offset radar and industry. Dramatized composite. We thought spirit could overcome science, but spirit cannot stop fire. Post-war interrogation report 1946. By July, even the most loyal officers whispered that defeat was inevitable. The sight of their great cities erased in hours broke more than supply chains. It broke faith in victory. Civilians bore the heaviest weight. Diaries found in the ruins of Nagoya, Kobe, and Tokyo spoke of hopelessness, of families shattered not only by flames, but by the realization that their leaders had failed them. Survivors described entire neighborhoods fleeing to rivers, only to suffocate from the firestorm's oxygen-starved winds. The psychological toll was incalculable. A survey of morale conducted secretly by Japanese police in mid-1945 concluded, confidence in the army's ability to protect the homeland is gone. Japanese Home Ministry report, 1945. In Washington and Guam, the strategic logic was cold. General Curtis LeMay and his staff measured progress not in morale but in square miles burned. They calculated that if firebombing continued, Japan would collapse without invasion. And yet, there was always the clock of war. An invasion of the home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, loomed on the horizon. Millions of lives were at stake. LeMay pressed forward, determined to accelerate surrender through flames. Joint Chiefs Planning Memorandum 1945. The raids also reshaped the very identity of American warfare. For the crews of the B-29s, victory came at the price of moral unease. Letters home revealed an inner conflict, pride in completing missions, shame at the destruction they left behind. Dramatized composite. They tell us we shortened the war, but when I close my eyes I still hear them screaming. Aircrew letter, June 1945. Yet the machine of war demanded endurance. Engineers in Kansas, chemists in Delaware, and riveters in Seattle continued their work, sustaining a campaign that would scar generations. On the Japanese side, despair gave way to grim resignation. Reports from the Imperial General Headquarters in July noted that industrial output had fallen by more than 40%. Rail lines clogged with refugees, factories lacked workers, and production collapsed. Rice warehouses and supply depots had burned, spreading hunger across the islands. Imperial Army Logistics Report, 1945. The once proud empire that dreamed of conquest from China to the Philippines now struggled merely to feed its own. The psychological impact stretched beyond Japan's borders. Allied commanders studied the firebombing with fascination and unease. British observers noted that entire metropolitan regions could be paralyzed with only a fraction of the effort once believed necessary. Soviet planners took careful notes, recognizing the value of incendiary campaigns for future conflicts. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. Even as the war raged on, the firestorms of Tokyo and Osaka were already reshaping military doctrine for the Cold War. When atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, they overshadowed the firebombing in public memory. Yet in raw numbers, the flames of March through August had killed far more. Over 330,000 Japanese civilians perished in the incendiary raids. In the ruins of Tokyo, survivors recalled the irony bitterly. Their officers had mocked the Americans, claiming night raids were futile. Now their capital had burned more completely than any city struck by nuclear fire. Tokyo Metropolitan Archives, 1946. For engineers and scientists, the legacy was both pride and burden. The innovations of the B-29, the pressurized cabin, the Wright R-3350 engines, the AN/APQ-13 radar became the foundation of Cold War aviation. Napalm, born in the laboratories of Harvard, would be used in Korea and Vietnam. The doctrine of overwhelming firepower, perfected in Japan, would echo decades later in Baghdad and Fallujah. U.S. Air Force Historical Study, 1953. The lesson was clear. In modern war, industrial science could not only defeat armies, but annihilate societies. The human cost, however, was not forgotten. American chaplains in Guam reported waves of guilt among crews. Japanese poets and survivors wrote of endless night skies filled with fire. Psychologists studying post-war Japan noted that survivors carried a permanent dread of the sound of engines. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Civilian Morale Appendix, 1946. The legacy of the raids was not only strategic dominance, but trauma carved into memory. The war ended in September 1945, but the firebombing left its shadow across generations. American officers debated whether it had been necessary, while Japanese survivors struggled to reconcile honor with devastation. General LeMay himself later admitted, "If we had lost, I suppose I would have been tried." Curtis LeMay interview, 1946. His words captured the paradox. Victory had spared judgment, but not doubt. And yet from the ruins a truth emerged. The mockery of American night raids had proven fatal arrogance. In dismissing the enemy's engineers and technicians, Japan had underestimated the silent war of innovation. The flames over Tokyo were not born solely in cockpits, but in laboratories, drafting tables and factory floors thousands of miles away. War had become not only a contest of soldiers, but of scientists and workers, of steel and circuitry, of fuel and fire. As the Cold War dawned, strategists carried forward the lesson. In modern war, no city is beyond reach. No night too dark, no doctrine too sacred. The firebombing of Japan proved that morale, spirit, and tradition could be undone by the invisible hand of technology and the relentless weight of industry. U.S. Air Force Doctrine Study, 1947. The story ends in silence. The silence after the firestorm. The silence in the charred ruins of Tokyo. The silence of survivors who had once heard their officers laugh. Their laughter died in the flames. And from those ashes came a universal lesson. In war, arrogance burns first. What survives is the truth, that science, steel, and preparation will always consume pride.